Imagine going to the doctor for, severe foot pain. And the solution they offer is to drill a hole in your bone and hammer in a tiny plug made out of the exact same synthetic ingredient used in your artificial tear eye drops.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds completely bizarre in its face.
It really does. But for a brief, shining moment in the medical world, that exact device won prestigious orthopedic awards. It actually triggered a $435 million corporate buyout.
Oh, and it had thousands of surgeons utterly convinced they had finally found the holy grail of joint repair.
Right, and then almost overnight, it triggered a massive global recall and these sprawling class action lawsuits. Welcome to another deep dive.
We often view modern medicine as this perfect, steady ladder of progress, right? A problem exists, science solves it, the solution is rigorously proven, and patients' lives improve.
That's the dream, yeah.
Exactly. But when you look closely at the life cycle of certain medical devices, that ladder looks a lot more like a volatile roller coaster.
Which brings us to our single source for today. It's an incredibly revealing commentary recently published in the journal Osteoarthritis and Cartilage.
Right, the piece titled Surgical Management of First Metatarsophalangeal Joint Osteoarthritis, The Rise and Fall of the Cartiva Synthetic Cartilage Implant.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today isn't just to talk about foot surgery. I mean, we're looking at a cautionary detective story.
It really is a detective story.
It's about how medical devices are vetted, how, well, borderline mathematics can be marketed as a medical miracle, and what happens when the physical reality of the human body violently clashes with an industry that is just desperate for a breakthrough.
And to understand the sheer velocity of the hype surrounding this Cartiva implant, you really have to first understand the stubborn nature of the problem it was trying to solve.
Right, the medical condition itself.
Yes, we are talking about hallux rigidus, which is osteoarthritis of the first metatarsophalangeal joint, basically the big toe.
Which is surprisingly common, right?
Oh, very. It affects roughly 8% of all individuals over the age of 50.
And look, if you've never had a serious foot issue, you might just dismiss that as a minor inconvenience. Like, oh, my toe hurts a bit.
Which is a huge misconception.
Exactly. Because the biomechanics of human locomotion are intensely demanding on that specific joint. Think about it. When you walk, as your heel lifts off the ground, your entire body weight pushes off through that big toe.
It takes an incredible amount of force, and when that joint develops advanced osteoarthritis, the cartilage wears away entirely.
So you're left with bone grinding directly on bone.
Yes, the range of motion becomes severely limited, and you experience debilitating, sharp pain with literally every single step you take. It completely impairs your locomotor function.
It ruins your quality of life. So
Yeah.
what do doctors usually do first?
Well, the initial treatments are conservative, as they always should be, you know. You use orthoses, maybe try rigid-soled footwear to limit the bending of the toe.
Sometimes corticosteroid injections, right?
Right. But osteoarthritis is progressive. It doesn't just go away. So for many patients, those non-surgical interventions eventually fail, leaving surgery as the only viable path to reclaim their mobility.
And historically, the surgical options have been a series of really frustrating compromises. Like, if the arthritis isn't completely end stage, a surgeon might perform a colectomy.
Which is essentially going in and scraping away the bone spurs from the top of the metatarsal head.
Yeah, just to clear up some space for the joint to actually move.
Mm-hmm.
But for advanced disease, the gold standard has traditionally been arthrodesis.
Right, a joint fusion.
Right, the surgeon removes whatever cartilage is left and literally fuses the metatarsal bone and the proximal phalanx bone together. They secure them with plates and screws, so they heal into one solid, continuous piece of bone.
Which effectively eliminates the pain, because there's no joint left to grind together.
Sure, but the mechanical trade-off is steep. It's essentially like welding a door hinge shut. It absolutely stops the door from squeaking, but you permanently lose the function of the door.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because you can never bend that toe joint again. And that fundamentally alters your gait, your ability to run, and, I mean, even the types of shoes you can physically wear.
And the limitations of that arthrodesis are precisely why finding a successful joint replacement, an arthroplasty that maintains the natural motion of the toe, has been the absolute holy grail for foot and ankle surgeons for decades.
The Holy Grail. But the history of trying to achieve that is just littered with catastrophic failures.
Yeah.
The source material covers some of those early attempts, and honestly, the physical consequences are staggering.
Oh, they were disastrous. Back in the
Right.
1950s, the field experimented with first MTP joint replacements made of silicone.
Silicone, like for a weight-bearing joint.
Yeah. The thinking was that silicone is pliable and could absorb the shock of walking, but they underestimated the forces. The sheer compressive and shear forces on the big toe are immense.
Oh, they just broke down.
Rapidly.
Hmm.
Those silicone devices suffered from intense wear and tear, but worse, the repetitive stress would cause the silicone to fracture into microscopic particles. And those particles didn't just stay in the foot, they would migrate through the patient's lymphatic system. There were actually documented cases of inguinal lymphadenopathy.
Wait, meaning the debris traveled all the way up into the lymph nodes in the groin.
Exactly, causing severe swelling and huge systemic immune reactions.
That is a nightmare scenario for a patient who, just wanted to walk their dog without wincing.
Truly. So obviously they shifted to harder materials, but that didn't solve the problem either.
Right. They moved to metal and ceramic components, the kind you typically see in hip or knee replacements.
Yes, but a hip is a large, well-protected ball and socket joint. The big toe is a tiny high-pressure hinge joint that bears the brunt of the body's push-off force.
It's totally different mechanics.
Completely. So the metal and ceramic implants had unacceptably high rates of loosening, the bone wouldn't integrate with the metal, the implants would shift, become malaligned, and ultimately fail.
Which is why joint replacement for the big toe was basically regarded by the orthopedic community as unpredictable and vastly inferior to simply fusing the joint.
Right, so the medical field is stuck, metal fails, silicone shatters, and bone fusion leaves you with a stiff foot.
So to find a solution, researchers had to look completely outside the realm of traditional orthopedics. And this is where it gets weird. They turned to polymer science, specifically a material called polyvinyl alcohol, or PVA.
Right, PVA. It's a synthetic polymer that is incredibly hydrophilic. It loves water.
But was being used in joints, was it?
No, not at all. Because of its very low protein absorption and lack of cellular adhesion, it was mostly utilized in ocular applications. It's actually the primary lubricating ingredient in many artificial tear eye drops.
Eye drops.
Yes, and it's commonly used in the hydrogel coatings of contact lenses.
Which brings us back to that wild premise I mentioned at the start, putting eye drop material inside a human bone. But, well, the mechanism behind why this makes sense is actually quite brilliant.
It really is. It comes down to how PVA behaves when it's fully hydrated. It absorbs massive amounts of water and forms a complex, flexible, elastic network.
Almost like a biological sponge?
Exactly. In this state, its mechanical properties and fluid dynamics are astonishingly similar to the extracellular matrix of human articular cartilage. Natural cartilage is basically a sponge filled with water that compresses and releases to absorb shock.
And PVA does exactly the same thing synthetically.
Right. And this realization led directly to the development of the Cartiva implant.
And the physical device itself is aggressively simple. I mean, it's not a complex mechanical hinge with screws and plates. It's just a tiny cylindrical plug, about 8 to 10 millimeters in diameter?
Yep, just a tiny plug. And the surgical procedure is similarly straightforward. The surgeon drills a small, precise hole into the head of the metatarsal bone,
Okay.
and then they just tap this polymer plug into the cavity. They leave just about 2 millimeters of the hydrogel sticking out above the bone surface.
So that tiny, protruding, water-filled cushion acts as the new gliding surface for the joint.
Exactly. And you can see why the appeal to surgeons and patients was immediate. It preserves the natural anatomy of the joint. It maintains a full range of motion.
It's relatively minimally invasive.
Yeah, and it utilizes a biomimetic material that mimics the body's natural shock absorbers rather than introducing hard metals that the body fights against.
But, okay, I have to ask about the physical physics of this.
What?
Wait, if this implant is essentially a highly engineered, water-filled contact lens, doesn't it run the risk of dehydrating and shrinking over time inside the bone? I mean, how does it handle the sheer mechanical load of a human being walking? You're putting your entire body weight on a 2-millimeter sliver of hydrogel.
Doesn't it just instantly crush under that pressure? That was the big question.
Right.
Well, in the laboratory environment, the testing indicated it wouldn't. The polymer network was designed to be incredibly tough, displacing the mechanical stress through its water content just like healthy cartilage.
So the lab said it was fine.
Yeah, the lab data suggested it was durable enough to withstand millions of cycles of compression. But, as we know, laboratory simulations don't always perfectly replicate the complex, long-term biological environment of a living human joint.
Right. And before it could be sold to the public, The manufacturer had to prove it worked in living humans through a clinical trial.
Which brings us to the motion trial.
The foundational study for the Cartiva device, it tracked 219 patients with advanced stage hallux rigidus over 24 months. One group received the traditional bone fusion, and the other group received the Cartiva implant.
But the authors of our source paper dissect the statistical design of this trial, and it reveals exactly how the implant slid through regulatory scrutiny.
Okay, lay it on us.
The most critical detail of the motion trial is that it was designed as a non-inferiority trial. It was not a superiority trial.
That's a massive distinction. When the public hears a device passed a clinical trial, the assumption is that the trial proved the new device is definitively better than the old way of doing things.
Naturally, yeah.
But a non-inferiority trial is fundamentally different. The researchers are basically just trying to prove mathematically that the new device is not worse than the existing standard of care.
Precisely. And the core issue with a non-inferiority trial is defining the boundaries of what constitutes not worse. Researchers have to pre-establish a margin of error.
Like how much worse it can be before it technically fails.
Right. They decide the percentage by which the new device could technically underperform the old standard, but still be statistically declared a success. For medical device trials dealing with categorical outcomes like this, the generally accepted standard margin is negative 10%.
Okay, but the motion trial didn't use a 10% margin. They arbitrarily widened the goalposts. They set the non-inferiority margin at negative 15%.
They gave themselves a much larger buffer for the implant to underperform.
And when the results came in at the 24-month mark, the Cartiva implant's performance landed right in that 5% gap between the standard 10% margin and their widened 15% margin.
What's fascinating here is how that statistical nuance was completely glossed over.
It was basically ignored.
Entirely. If the trial had adhered to the traditional, stricter 10% margin, the Cartiva device would have mathematically failed the trial compared to bone fusion. The entire declaration that the implant was non-inferior was entirely dependent on that relaxation of statistical rigor.
But that caveat certainly didn't make it into the marketing brochures. The authors of the trial heavily promoted the fact that pain and function scores improved for the Cartiva group.
And that at the 2-year mark, there were no reported cases of the implant fragmenting.
Right, they confidently declared it an excellent, motion-preserving alternative to fusion.
And the orthopedic community, who, remember, were desperate for a solution that wasn't a bone fusion, enthusiastically embraced the findings. In 2015, the paper detailing the motion trial won the Roger A. Mann Award at the annual meeting of the American Orthopedic Foot and Ankle Society.
Which is a massive endorsement in that field. With that momentum, the FDA granted the Cartiva implant pre-market approval in July 2016. And our source actually includes a Google Trends graph that perfectly visualizes the resulting explosion in public interest.
It's quite a visual.
It really is. The search volume for Cartiva is completely flat for years, and then in late 2016, it just shoots vertical. It looks exactly like the adoption curve for a new blockbuster weight loss drug. 0 to 100 almost overnight, driven entirely by clinical hype and marketing.
The clinical uptake was staggering. Between 2016 and 2019, surgeons in the United States alone implanted over 22,000 of these devices.
22,000.
Yeah, and the financial sector reacted accordingly. In 2018, Wright Medical Group saw an opportunity to corner the market and bought the Cartiva company in a massive $435 million acquisition.
So to the executives and the shareholders, the implant was a certified home run.
Oh, absolutely.
But out in the real world, as thousands of independent surgeons began putting this hydrogel plug into diverse patient populations, outside the tightly controlled parameters of a clinical trial, the data began to sharply fracture.
Yes. Independent retrospective studies started rolling in, and the findings were alarming.
What were they seeing?
Well, while some clinics reported outcomes similar to the original trial, a significant number of researchers couldn't replicate the positive results at all. They were seeing severe, widespread complications.
Oh, bad.
A major systematic review analyzing 1,349 patients with the Cartiva implant reported a staggering 28% complication rate, and that was at an average follow-up of just 24 months.
Wow. Over a quarter of the patients were experiencing failures within 2 years. And this gets to the physical mechanism of what was actually going wrong, going back to my question earlier about it shrinking.
Yes, your intuition was spot on.
The lab test said the hydrogel could handle the compression. But in the biological environment of the bone, the implant was suffering from severe dehydration and shrinkage.
This is where the physical design of the surgery becomes its fatal flaw. Remember, the implant is an 8 mm plug sitting inside a drilled hole in the bone, standing just 2 mm above the surface.
Right.
When that hydrogel slowly dried out and shrank inside the body, it lost that 2 mm buffer. It retreated entirely below the surface of the bone.
So suddenly you don't have a slippery water cushion absorbing the impact. You literally have a hollowed out hole in the metatarsal.
Yes. And the hard, raw edges of that drilled bone are now totally exposed. They start acting like a cookie cutter, grinding directly against the cartilage of the proximal phalanx with every single step the patient takes.
Ouch. I mean, the resulting damage had to be severe.
It was. Patients experienced rapid joint space narrowing. The grinding caused massive bone erosion in the adjacent bones. They developed deep tissue swelling, edema. The FDA's database was just flooded with voluntary adverse event reports.
The irony for the patients is devastating
Okay.
because they specifically elected to have the Cartiva implant to preserve the motion in their foot and avoid a bone fusion.
Exactly.
But because the implant shrank and the bone began grinding on bone, they were left in absolute agony.
And the only viable solution for these patients was a secondary, highly invasive revision surgery. And in the vast majority of cases, that revision surgery was the exact arthrodesis, the bone fusion, that they had initially tried to avoid.
Only now it's so much worse.
Right. They had to undergo the fusion after enduring months or years of excruciating pain. Plus, the surgeon had significantly less healthy bone stock to work with because the failed implant had caused so much erosion.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How did the initial researchers completely miss this shrinkage in a 24-month trial? I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Well, in 2021, an independent researcher dug back into the original motion trial data to find out. They reanalyzed the raw data, but this time they stripped away that generous 15% margin and applied standard, stringent criteria for success.
So they basically ran the numbers fairly.
Yes. They tested the data against 3 alternative, highly justifiable clinical standards. First, they asked, what if we require a patient's clinical pain score to actually match their radiographic interpretation?
Meaning, you can't just say your foot feels okay. The X-ray must objectively show that the joint space hasn't collapsed.
Exactly. Second, what if we strictly define any major surgical revision as a complete failure of the implant?
Which seems obvious.
You would think. And third, what if we just enforce a slightly stricter, universally accepted threshold for what constitutes a meaningful reduction in pain?
And the findings of the reanalysis were damning. If you applied any single one of those 3 standard criteria to the original data, Cartiva comprehensively failed the non-inferiority test against bone fusion.
It wasn't even close.
The foundational trial that birthed the $435 million industry was balancing on a knife's edge of statistical manipulation.
Now, the authors of the commentary are careful to note that borderline statistical design isn't necessarily proof of malicious intent,
Sure.
but it undeniably highlights a systemic vulnerability. When a regulatory body accepts a heavily massaged interpretation of data, it gives doctors and patients a false sense of security that the device has been definitively proven.
And once surgeons realized the reality of that data, the market collapsed just as fast as it had exploded. Surgeons started sharing their failure rates with each other, and the use of the device plummeted. Public interest, as tracked by Google Trends, dropped off a cliff.
The financial fallout followed the clinical fallout, as it always does. Wright Medical Group's stock took a severe hit as the complication reports mounted. In late 2019, Stryker, which is an even larger medical technology conglomerate, acquired Wright Medical Group, effectively inheriting this escalating disaster.
And the inevitable finally happened. In October 2024, Stryker issued an urgent recall of the Cartiva implant.
The official recall notice cited emerging clinical evidence that patients were suffering a higher than expected rate of complications compared to what was originally promised. The device was pulled from the market entirely.
Which invariably brings in the legal system. A multitude of class action lawsuits are currently pending. The plaintiffs allege that the device was inherently defective due to its tendency to shrink and dehydrate.
And more pointedly, that the manufacturers knew, or reasonably should have known, about these severe flaws before aggressively marketing it as a safe alternative to fusion.
A U.S. federal judge has actually ordered the involved parties into settlement discussions. And if no agreement is reached, a massive trial is slated for August 2026. It is an absolute, unmitigated clinical and legal mess.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the authors emphasize that the Cartiva debacle is not an isolated incident. It perfectly maps onto a known phenomenon in the surgical world called Scott's parabola.
Right, Scott's parabola, which is essentially the medical equivalent of a hype cycle. We see a shiny new technological breakthrough. Surgeons who are eager for better solutions adopt it rapidly. The adoption curve goes straight up.
But the long-term, independent, real-world data inevitably takes years to catch up.
Exactly. And when it finally does, the flaws are exposed, and the usage curve crashes violently back down into deep disillusionment.
The commentary identifies two major systemic flaws that practically guarantee Scott's parabola will continue to claim victims. The first is the nature of our regulatory environment. The FDA approval process fundamentally forces a dichotomous black and white outcome. A device either passes or it fails.
But human biology is never that simple. The decision to implant a synthetic polymer into a weight-bearing joint is incredibly complex. I mean, it depends on the patient's specific anatomy, their activity level, and the physical properties of their unique bone structure.
Yes.
So when the FDA stamps a binary approved on a device based on a trial with a 15% non-inferiority margin, it completely strips away all of that necessary nuance.
The second systemic issue is the immense pressure of the medical-industrial complex. The reality of healthcare capitalism is that developing a new medical device costs millions, and acquiring one costs hundreds of millions.
Like the $435 million buyout.
Exactly. Once a corporate entity makes that investment, there is an intense financial imperative to rapidly expand the use of the intervention.
The company has to aggressively market the device to recoup their investment and generate a profit for their shareholders. And that aggressive marketing can so easily overpower the cautious, evidence-based skepticism that should define medical practice.
Which leads to the author's primary plea to the medical community. We must consciously work to flatten the adoption curve for new technologies.
Slow things down.
Right. Surgeons and hospital administrators need to be deeply critical of the statistics behind clinical trials. They need to demand independent evidence that isn't sponsored by the manufacturer. And crucially, the medical community must rigorously monitor the long-term safety of a device in the real world rather than blindly trusting an initial FDA approval.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, the next time you're sitting in a doctor's office?
Yeah.
Well, the rise and fall of Cartiva is a stark reminder that being an informed patient means asking the difficult questions. When a new, heavily marketed treatment seems like a miraculous quick fix, you have to ask about the long-term data.
You really do.
You have to understand that FDA approved is a regulatory threshold, not a magical guarantee of safety. Because sometimes that approval is built on very generous, highly engineered math.
It's a complex reality to navigate, and it leaves us with a provocative question that extends far beyond the realm of foot surgery. If our medical regulatory systems continue to demand simple, multiple-choice, pass-fail answers to govern incredibly complex, dynamic human bodies, are we inadvertently guaranteeing that Scott's parabola will just keep repeating itself with the next multi-million-dollar medical fad?
It's something to think about the next time you hear about a medical miracle. We all desperately want the steady ladder of scientific progress, but the truth of human biology is usually a lot more complicated. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.